Hi guys, Freddy here, and this time I would like to look at this Dungeons Dragons Only a Game. Now, this is a religious pamphlet, a leaflet handed out to churches and by religious groups in the United States in the early 1980s. I think it's about 1982, 1983, maybe. All of the dates within the leaflet itself reference stuff from the 70s and early 80s, 1980, 1981-ish. So I guess it's from that period. Now, this is part of the Satanic panic that was happening in the United States at the time. The scares about rock and roll music, about heavy metal, about Dungeons and Dragons, all leading your kids to start worshipping Satan. And I've been aware of all this. Obviously, I've seen the stuff in newer things. The latest season of Stranger Things has a big element about the satanic panic and people looking at Dungeons and Dragons as actually leading to real life witchcraft and demons. But in Scotland, we didn't get that. The reaction to you saying you played Dungeons and Dragons as a teenager was, "Oh, you're playing a kid's game. You're playing like Monopoly." And that was it. To appear grown up, of course, in Scotland, you had to play football or you had to go and watch football. So playing games, video games, or Dungeons and Dragons were all seen as a kid's thing at the time. So the Satanic Panic wasn't a thing over here, but I've read about it. I've seen things since. I've seen the Tom Hanks movie, what was it, The Dungeon Master or something like that, Mazes and Monsters. One of these terrible movies where he becomes his character and he tries to leap off the Twin Towers. Absolutely dreadful Tom Hanks movie. Very, very funny to watch, though. I've read the book by the investigator who looked for Thomas Dallas Egbert III, the kid who disappeared that they thought was because he was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it turned out he was actually gay and he was getting repressed by everybody around him, so he ran away to be himself. But this was totally foreign to me. So finding this leaflet online and getting it pointed out to me was fantastic. And I've read through it and I've had a whale of a time, tons of laughter. So I'd like to go through it with you. So, first of all, I actually quite like the cover. The clip art is very reminiscent of early Dungeons and Dragons. The castle with the clouds around it on the mountain, with a trail going up to it. Very emotive of going to adventure. Quite a terrible little dragon and a nice little sword. I don't know whether these are lifted out of a Dungeons and Dragons rulebook, but they are very reminiscent of the art style of the time. Inside, what is D&D? Dungeons and Dragons, commonly known as D&D, is an elaborate fantasy game which evolved from the war games popular in the late 1950s. Instead of a historical battlefield and battle, D&D games are fought in the minds of the players as the DM, Dungeon Master, or God. Well, there's my first comment. I'm taking that. I'm not being a games master anymore. I want people to call me their god. I've always said that the various titles used in role-playing games annoyed me. You know, in Call of Cthulhu, you're the Keeper. In Dungeons & Dragons, you're the Dungeon Master. You should just be Games Master. Well, let's refine that. Let's just be gods from now on. But anyway, the god sets the stage in the fantasy world. Each player assumes the identity of a character he creates. His creature is based on the chance roll of the dice. Each character will have 6 basic abilities: strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. The manual guidelines will determine whether the character will be good or evil. Well, that's all actually fairly accurate. Good on them. They seem to actually know something about what they're talking. At the moment. The object of the game is to maneuver these characters through a maze of dungeons, tunnels, filled with monsters, magic, ambushes, and adventures in search of treasures. To survive, each character is equipped with special aids, such as magical weapons, potions, spells, and magical trinkets, holy water, garlic, wolves-bane, etc. They're also given more conventional weapons, daggers, hand axes, swords, and battle axes. Again, pretty accurate. The game is for 3 or more players, aged 10 and upward. Each player can stay in the game as long as his character is not killed, from hours to years. If it continues long, most players identify themselves with their characters, and the line between fantasy and reality tends to grow fuzzy. Evidence needed. I've never known anyone who's mistaken themselves for their character. Yes, sometimes in conversation we will talk about what we did, because we were doing it within the game, but we don't think we were our characters. I can see why people would misunderstand that, but you're telling a story where you did something in a game. If you're talking about Risk, you'll talk about you taking a certain area. You won't say, well, I was playing as Austria and Austria took that area. It's just the way language works. One authority concerning this game said, the stuff that makes me nervous is over-identification with the characters. I've seen people have fits, yell for 15 minutes, hurl dice at a grand piano when their character dies. I want to know where those people were playing. Where the hell do they have a grand piano? All the games I've played have been round dingy little tables, people's dining tables, coffee tables in student labs when I was at university. Terrible little places to play. Nowhere has had extensive space and a grand piano. What is D&D? Dr. Gary North, author of None Dare Call It Witchcraft, says, after years of study of the history of occultism, having researched a book on the subject, and after having consulted with scholars in the field of historical research, I can say with confidence, these games are the most effective, most magnificently packaged, most profitably marketed, most thoroughly researched introduction to the occult in man's recorded history. Now, if I was publishing a role-playing game, now that's a slogan I want on the cover. The most effective, most magnificently packaged, most profitably marketed, most thoroughly researched introduction to the occult in man's recorded history. By Dr. Gary North. There's a quote to use. What is D&D? They keep asking the same question. After extensive research, the Christian Life Ministries concludes Dungeons & Dragons, instead of a game, is a teaching on demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, Satan worship, gambling, Jungian psychology, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, necromantics, divination, and many more teachings, brought to you in living colour direct from the pit of hell. Now that's a slogan I definitely want on a t-shirt. That's such a good list. But picking out something amongst that, Jungian psychology, which is the psychology of the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind and bringing those together. Why is that amongst voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination? Why Jungian psychology? Really bizarre. But so funny. This is strong language. Yes, it is. But its truthfulness is established in a careful examination of the books. Look in almost any toy store or bookstore. You will probably find 20 or more books on how to play D&D. They are complicated, intricate, bizarre, expensive, many selling for $10.95 each, and popular. Oh, the 1980s, when you could buy a D&D book for $10.95. That'd be lovely to be back then. How widely used? According to statistics released by the news media, over 3 million Americans are playing D&D. The industry grossed more than $250 million in 1981 and expects a large increase in 1982. Hence me thinking this was published in 1982. Many schools are using D&D, especially in gifted and talented programs. Special classroom versions are being produced. Some state-supported colleges offer classes, while others have cancelled them at the insistence of concerned parents and taxpayers. Well, why taxpayers, essentially? Concerned parents should have a control over what's taught at school. Yes. You should have an input into what your child learns. That is the basic right of every parent, to decide what their children is taught. But why do taxpayers get to say? I know taxpayers pay for it, but it's a state thing which should be run by the government for the benefit of everybody. But taxpayers shouldn't have any extra say into what their tax dollars are spent on. I don't get to say which nuclear missiles we get to buy when I pay taxes. And this is the start of a trend, because taxes come up again. Parents, teachers, ministers, youth directors, and all young people should spend time in serious research on FRP, fantasy role-playing games, because their use is escalating. The issue must be faced by all of us sooner or later. Yes, absolutely. Everybody should research role-playing games. Go for it, because we'll get lots more players that way. Other FRP games. New games are being created, more sophisticated and cruel than the original D&D, such as RuneQuest. We've all heard of RuneQuest. Chivalry and Sorcery. Bit of an older one, but I think many of us will have heard of that. Arduin Grimoire. What? I've never heard of this. Tunnels and Trolls. Yay! I've covered Tunnels and Trolls on this channel. Yay! Etc. In the rulebook to Arduin Grimoire game is listed as critical hit table. Oppositions listed are hit location crotch chest, results genitals breast torn off, shock. Hit location guts ripped out, result 20% chance of tangling feet, die in 1 to 10 minutes. Hit location head pulped and splattered over a wide area. So critical hit charts are a bit gory. They're not the worst I've ever seen, but they're obviously being picked out of a fairly obscure book, obscure game, because they sound terrible to random readers. On page 10, the Dread Vampusa, a macho beast man with writhing snakes for hair and a skull face, bristles with Neanderthal sexual imagery. His left hand holding out a long, sharp lance sticking straight out from his genitals, dripping blood, his penis hanging limp just above it. Now, I had no idea what a Dread Vampusa was. Prepare yourself for what that actually looks like, because I went and Googled it. And here we go, the Dread Vampusa. Now, what did that say? Neanderthal imagery? Okay, it's a naked guy. Snakes for hair, yes, absolutely. Blood dripping lance sticking out from his crotch, yep, absolutely. His penis hanging limply. Right, I can see what they think is it. I can see this. I think that's just a reflection of light on his thigh. This is obviously shadow. The artist isn't the world's best artist, but I think he could draw a winky better than that. I don't think that's what they think it is. I think they're seeing what they want to see, which is obviously winkies. Anyway, Arduin's creator, Dave Hargrave, defends the grisly specificity. He states, it's deliberately gruesome. You have to blow a hole through that video shell the kids are encased in. They're little zombies. They don't know what pain is. They've never seen a friend taken out in a body bag. They've got to understand that what they do has consequences. The world is sex. It is violence. It's going to destroy most of these kids when they leave TV land. So Hargrave admits the game is designed for kids, supposedly to equip them for the reality of life. Well, I think that's horrible. I'm not keen on what that guy writes at all. Having gory games and targeting them towards adults is great. I've spoken at length on this channel about one of my favourite games being Blood, which has massively gory critical hit tables. You know, your blade goes down into his foot and his toe wiggles freely on the floor. There's fountains of blood, there's broken bones with the bone jutting out of the arm and things like that. Absolutely. They are amazingly fun to go through, but they should not be for kids. But have they read the Bible? That's a book which has fairly gruesome tales in it. Stories about girls seducing their father so they can bear his children. And that's to teach kids lessons. So if books can teach lessons from grisly things, perhaps they should look at their own book. Witchcraft is a religion. In the greater Sacramento, California area, there are some 1,000 practicing witches. Citation needed. I would like to know where they got that figure from. Divided into a number of covens, several covens are recognized by the state of California as bona fide religions, given tax-exempt status as churches. Again with the taxes. Why is that important? Why is something being tax-exempt special? Because they think their religion is special and should be the only ones granted that right. No, people can worship what they want, and if tax exemption for being a charitable institution, which doesn't get involved in politics, is the grounds, then anybody should be able to qualify. George Marsh, member of the Cordova Park School Board, stated in a letter to the editor that he voted to remove D&D from the school district's summer program. The Supreme Court has already barred religious activity from public facilities. Dungeons & Dragons is clearly religious in content. Okay. Although D&D is not a religion per se, it's teaching religious principles and familiarizing its 3 million devotees with terms and rituals of occult forms of religion. What does God say about this? Well, I'm not going to quote the Bible, and I'm not going to do the other quotes further down here, although I will pick out some key moments. For example, most spells have a verbal component, and so must be uttered from the D&D Player's Handbook, page 40. That's saying the character has to utter it, not that you have to read out the spell. Because as we know, most Dungeons & Dragons spells are a blade of light goes from your fingers and strikes the opponent for so many d4 damage. That's hardly a spell that you need to utter out loud. Talks about incantations, spellcasters, concerning clerics. Note that all spells must be spoken or read aloud. In other sections, the gods are referred to as deity. It is known to all experienced players spells bestowed upon them by their respective deities. Each cleric must have his own deity. They may draw a big thing to the use of the word deity. Well, I know it refers to gods. It's the general term. I looked it up. It's from a polytheistic background where the individual gods are called deities. So, if you're a Christian, God is not a deity. He is God. It's only if you follow a religion which has multiple gods that they are deities. I didn't know that. I think in language these days we probably just use the phrase, but I was interested to find out the exact term because they are complaining about it being used. Talks about resurrection. Word demon appears 106 times. Talks about human sacrifice. There's bits here. Non-human soldiers, the less intelligent non-human, will serve for 10 to 60% less cost, but these evil creatures will certainly expect to loot, pillage, and rape freely at every chance, and kill and probably eat captives. Now, they've highlighted the rape freely, but the most important word is these evil characters, the evil creatures, sorry, there it is. Evil. They're the monsters. They're the things to be fought. They're the bad guys. Talks about defiling fonts and things. If D&D is only a game, why do the writers use Christian terms? Atonement, clergy, deity, divine ascension, divine being, faith, gods, healing, heaven, prayer, fasting, resurrection, soul, spirit, worship, spreading the gospel, etc. in a blasphemous way. Wait a second. Healing? Healing is a Christian term? Have a word with your local hospital about that. Every character must have a character class. It talks about the different ones. What is wrong with role-playing or fantasizing? Well, I definitely wonder about this, because why is playing a character bad? Why does it make authors who make up characters automatically bad? Some mistakenly believe that role-playing is merely acting out a character. Much more is involved. Psychodrama techniques were introduced in the early 1900s by Dr. Jacob L. Marino, a contemporary of Freud. He said his objective was to develop a positive religion. That's not Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons didn't come out until the late 1960s, early 1970s, where the ideas coalesced. Carrying on, testimony of negative effects. I really do like this section. John Terrell with Christian Life Ministries in California received a phone call from a medical doctor in Seattle, Washington. The doctor is treating a policeman for severe depression caused by the suicide of his 16-year-old son who had been heavily involved in D&D for 2 years, shot himself with his father's service revolver. Well, first of all, father's service revolver should be secured and not available for his son to get hold of. So that's a weapons infraction, I would say, rather than anything to do with Dungeons & Dragons. But John Terrell of Christian Life Ministries received a phone call from a doctor who'd spoken to a policeman whose son was playing Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, sure it wasn't his cousin's neighbour's cat's dog, you know? Next up, we've got, if I had a child who tended towards schizophrenia, I'd never let him near D&D. Well, that seems like good advice. See if you've got a kid with schizophrenia. Control what they've got access to, especially control that they've not got access to firearms for a start, but control what they've got access to because they're ill and they need help. A city police department in central Washington asks, are you a participant in fantasy role-playing games, as a standard question? Okay, that seems like a drastic overshoot since there's no evidence that that's a bad thing. Or at least none provided in here. 2 people convicted of firing over 3 rounds into passing motor vehicles admitted they constantly fantasized killing someone. That's nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. They fantasized about killing someone, and then they had access to guns. People who fantasize about killing people shouldn't have access to guns. Other police departments have confirmed some correlation between fantasy role-playing games and incidents showing up on their police blotter. Many people are innocently drawn into fantasy role-playing games. However, enough information is now available to reveal their true nature and real danger. There's no need for wise and alert people to be further duped. Yeah, those insidious Dungeons and Dragons games, sneaking people in. Hey, want to play some Monopoly? This isn't Monopoly, this is Dungeons and Dragons! Even some Christians tried to defend D&D and other fantasy role-playing games. In this futile attempt, one said, but the game is helpful because it shows the difference between good and evil characters. To this brilliant non-player replied, not so. Nearly everyone would rather play evil characters because they are much more powerful. Well, firstly, they're not. And secondly, they're not as powerful at all because good characters will work with each other towards a goal. Whereas if you're playing evil, you're out for yourself, so you'll betray everybody around you, so evil tends to be self-destructive, going by the very specific way that it's laid out in Dungeons and Dragons. Evil characters don't prosper because they will backstab everyone around them when they need to, so nobody can trust one another. In light of the quotes from their own literature, it would be wise to consider, does this game promote respect for sanctity of life, or does it rather serve as a basic training in brutality and disregard for life? Does it increase or decrease a player's faith in God and his word? Does Monopoly? Does it trivialize, even blaspheme Christianity? No. In summary, does it overall influence try to build up or tear down character? Well, it's all about making up characters, so it's definitely building up. I've spent many hours building characters in role-playing games. What can you do? Distribute this leaflet to young people, youth directors, ministers, teachers, school administrators, school board members, place them in tract racks, waiting rooms, etc. Okay. If you lack time to do this, send a donation of $10 or more to the address below to help distribute the leaflet to the above-mentioned groups. Send us money. Revised printing. Note, if page references differ from your book, remember the different versions of D&D books. For instance, at least 2 versions of deities and demigods, the original with 144 pages, a newer version with 128 pages. And then we've got who it's from, the Pro Family Forum in Fort Worth, Texas. Well, I find that incredibly wrong. But obviously, because I'm a role player, I like these games. But I just found it hilarious. A glimpse back 40 years to the idiocy of people trying to fight against Dungeons and Dragons when the world has just changed under their feet now. All the things that they're complaining about in here are just so ingrained in society. Compare the gore of playing Call of Duty games to just the mere descriptions of, oh, it mentions demons some 100 times in the rulebook. Anyway, I think I whittled on for way too long as usual. So thank you very much for watching. But most of all, as always, you look after yourselves and I'll catch you later. Bye now.